Let me begin with something that should not be controversial but somehow is. Friday the 13th is not ancient. The superstition, the specific crystallized fear of a Friday landing on the 13th day of a month, does not trace cleanly back to antiquity the way we are told it does. The deeper I looked into the historical record, the more the timelines seemed to shift and blur. What I found was not a superstition that evolved organically from centuries of human fear. What I found was something that looks far more like a construction, something assembled from parts that were individually meaningful, even sacred, and then deliberately recombined into something monstrous. Not an accident, not folklore drift, not the slow accumulation of coincidental bad luck across generations, something else. And that distinction matters more than you might think. Here is what we are told. We are told that the number 13 has always been unlucky, a sinister intruder in the sequence of 12, an unwelcome guest at the table of the apostles, a disruptor of cosmic order. We are told that Friday carries a shadow, the day of crucifixion, the day Eve tempted Adam, the day misfortune walks through unlocked doors. And we are told that when these two ancient fears collided, they produced something uniquely terrible. A day so cursed it earned its own phobia, phobia, fear of Friday the 13th, a word so clinical it almost obscures how strange it actually is. But here is the question no one asks. What did 13 mean before it meant bad luck? What did Friday mean before it meant dread? Because something existed before the fear, something was replaced. And once you see what was there first, once you actually look at it, the official explanation collapses, quietly, completely. I want to talk about Friday. Not the Friday we inherited, but the one that existed before the church calendar and the Gregorian reckoning and the slow standardization of Western time. The word itself is a clue. Frigidag in Old English. Frigg's Day, or perhaps Freya's Day, the etymological line between these two Norse goddesses, has never been cleanly drawn, which is itself suggestive. Both represent love, fertility, abundance, the deep ordering power of femininity. In Latin traditions, the same day carries a different name but an identical meaning. Dies Veneris, Venus's day. The planet Venus, the goddess Venus, the principle of Venus, beauty, desire, creation, the morning star, the evening star, the one celestial body bright enough to cast shadows. Friday was not always a day of dread. In multiple pre-Christian traditions across Europe and the ancient Near East, Friday was sacred. It was the day associated with the most generative force in the cosmos, the day for celebration, for marriages, for gratitude. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across cultures that had no contact with one another. Venus, Friday, feminine sacred energy, abundance, and then quietly, gradually, and then quite suddenly, that meaning inverted. This raises a simple but critical question. When a symbol reverses its meaning across multiple cultures within a compressed historical window, do we call that coincidence, or do we call it coordination? Now let us talk about 13, and I mean really talk about it, not the shorthand version, the Judas at the table, the unlucky baker's dozen, the number that does not fit. Let us go back further. 13 is the number of lunar cycles in a solar year. Not approximately, not poetically, precisely. The moon completes 13 full cycles, 13 months of approximately 28 days each, within the span of a single solar revolution of Earth. This is mathematics. This is astronomy. This is the kind of knowledge that ancient humans who watch the sky with an attention we have largely abandoned would have noticed immediately and built entire systems of meaning around. And they did. The deeper I went into pre-Gregorian calendrical history, the more 13-month systems I found. The evidence is not hidden, it is scattered across archaeological records, anthropological studies, ethnographic accounts of indigenous peoples worldwide. The ancient Celtic tree calendar, 13 months, the Mayan Tzolk'in, with its 13-day cycle forming the backbone of an entire cosmological system. The ancient Egyptian civil calendar, with its 13 units. The evidence from Mesoamerica, from West Africa, from pre-Roman Europe, from the indigenous cultures of North America. The pattern repeats. 13 months. Lunar reckoning. Women's cycles synchronized with the moon's cycles, both running on approximately 28 days, both running on 13 in a year. This is not a coincidence. This is not myth. This is the actual mathematics of the Earth-Moon relationship, preserved in calendrical systems across the ancient world. And then those systems were phased out, every single one of them within a historically peculiar window. The 12-month calendar, the Gregorian calendar, the Julian before it, the Roman system that both descended from, asserted itself across the known world with what can only be described as institutional force. 12 months, 12 apostles, 12 gods of Olympus, 12 hours of the day, 12 of the night, 12 tribes, 12 signs of the zodiac as primary organizational principle rather than 13 lunar stations. 12 became sacred, 12 became correct. And 13, the number that had described the moon's own rhythm, the number that had been embedded in calendrical systems across civilizations, became the remainder. The excess, the number that did not belong, not just unlucky, actively removed, erased, replaced. Here is where the official narrative begins to strain. We are asked to accept that the transition from 13-month lunar calendars to 12-month solar ones was simply a matter of administrative convenience, a practical upgrade. The Julian calendar imposed Roman order on a chaotic world of regional timekeeping, and gradually, through reason and efficiency, it won. But look at what the evidence actually shows. The transition was not gradual in many regions. The documentation of the older systems is, in several cases, suspiciously sparse, not just incomplete, absent. What we have are remnants, fragments in the margins of manuscripts, anomalous feast days that do not align with official liturgical logic, folk traditions that preserve 13-unit structures long after the institutional systems abandoned them, as if the populations themselves did not fully relinquish something they were told to forget. The silence was deafening. When a calendrical system is abandoned through genuine cultural evolution, we expect to find the transition period documented. We expect debates, letters, competing arguments, the paper trail of societies working something out. What we find instead, in multiple instances, is a gap, a before, an after, and in between, very little. This raises a simple but critical question. Why would cultures that meticulously recorded astronomical observations, agricultural cycles, and religious festivals leave so little documentation of abandoning the very systems that organize their time? And here is the strangest part. The places where 13-month systems persisted longest, the Ethiopian calendar still has 13 months, and Ethiopia was never colonized in the conventional sense, which may be relevant, are precisely the places where the broader cultural campaign to stigmatize the number 13 took hold least completely. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Let us be precise about what I mean when I say construction. I am not claiming that a group of men sat in a candlelit room and decided on a specific Tuesday in the medieval period to make Friday the 13th unlucky. History rarely works that way, and that framing is too convenient, too cinematic, too easy to dismiss. What I'm suggesting is something more interesting and, I think, more disturbing. That the stigmatization of 13 and the inversion of Friday's sacred meaning were parallel processes. That they reinforced one another, that they served interlocking institutional purposes, and that their eventual fusion into the singular phobia of Friday the 13th was the culmination of a long, slow project of cultural reframing. The official explanation for Friday's unluckiness leans heavily on Christian tradition, the day of crucifixion, the day of the fall. But this explanation collapses here. Those associations were themselves chosen. of 7 days in a week. Why was the execution placed on Venus's day specifically? Why not another? The association of misfortune with Friday predates the mainstream popularization of these narratives in forms that reached ordinary people. And when you trace the pre-Christian traditions that called Friday sacred, the Norse, the Roman, the broader Mediterranean world, you find that the inversion of Friday from sacred to cursed aligns suspiciously well with the institutional suppression of the traditions that had venerated it. This is not happening accidentally, not through cultural drift, not through random historical chance. This is what the systematic erasure of a symbol looks like when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. And what does it mean practically when a superstition becomes standardized? This is where the story becomes, to my mind, genuinely consequential, not just as historical curiosity, but as a case study in how perception is manufactured and maintained. The fear of Friday the 13th is not universal. Anthropologists have documented this carefully, even if the documentation rarely makes it into popular accounts. In Spanish and Greek traditions, it is Tuesday the 13th that carries the omen Martes Trece, Tuesday being named for Mars, the god of war and chaos. In Italy, 17 is the number of misfortune, not 13. These variations are not footnotes, they are evidence. They tell us that the specific combination of Friday and 13, as a unified phobia, is not the natural flowering of universal human intuition. It is particular. It is located. It emerged from a specific cultural tradition in a specific historical window and was then exported through colonialism, through the dominance of Western calendrical systems, through the worldwide spread of particular institutional forms as if it were timeless truth. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The number 13 began to disappear from physical space. This is documented. Hotels numbered their floors without a 13th. Airlines skipped row 13. Street addresses jumped from 12 to 14. Residential buildings in cities across the Western world and its cultural satellites quietly agreed to pretend that a number did not exist. Not through any mandate, not through explicit coordination, but through a shared anxiety so successfully installed in the cultural firmware that it required no further instruction to perpetuate itself. This is what successful symbolic reframing looks like. When a number can be physically removed from the built environment, from the architecture of the world people inhabit daily, without significant protest, without most people even noticing the gap, that is not coincidence. That is the mark of something deeply embedded. The evidence suggests something much larger than folk superstition. Let me describe the mechanism as clearly as I can. Repetition is the engine of normalized perception, not argument, not proof, repetition. A claim, a symbol, an association, a meaning does not become cultural truth through a single authoritative statement. It becomes truth through the accumulation of iterations. Each time Friday the 13th is referenced with a slight tonal shift, a narrator's portentous pause, a film title, a hesitation before signing a contract dated the 13th, the association is reinforced. Each reinforcement requires less active attention to maintain. Eventually, the association exists in the background of consciousness, operating as assumption rather than conclusion. The theological arguments against 13, against Friday, against lunar reckoning, these were the initial installation. The folk traditions were the maintenance, the horror films, the news segments, the jokes, the insurance industry's documented losses on Friday the 13th. These are the current iteration. The form changes, the function is identical. What function? Here is where I want to be careful and precise and resist the pull towards certainty. I do not know who benefits most from a population that flinches at the lunar number, that has been trained to read the moon's own rhythm as malevolent. I do not know whose interests were served by the inversion of Venus's sacred day into a day of dread. I am asking the question, not answering it, but the question seems to me worth asking, because the alternative, the official version, is that all of this happened by accident. That the number aligned with lunar cycles and feminine sacred time became unlucky by coincidence. That the day named for the planet of love and abundance became ominous through uncoordinated cultural drift. That 13-month calendars were phased out because 12 is simply more convenient. And that the stigmatization of 13 as a number had nothing to do with the administrative and theological projects that were simultaneously discrediting the worldview those calendars encoded. That is a great deal to accept as coincidence. There is a kind of knowledge that does not survive institutional suppression well. It is not the knowledge written in books. Books survive when they are copied, indexed, protected by institutions that want them preserved. The knowledge I am describing is different. It is calendrical knowledge, embodied knowledge, the knowledge of people who organize their time and their bodies and their understanding of the cosmos around a 28-day cycle that corresponded to both the moon and, not incidentally, the menstrual cycle. When you stigmatize the number that encodes that cycle, you do not merely make a number unlucky. You make the entire framework of knowledge that the number represents seem suspect, superstitious, primitive. You create the conditions under which people will voluntarily abandon a system of understanding, not because they have been given a better one necessarily, but because they have been given a safer one. A system with social approval, a system that will not get you looked at sideways, that will not mark you as someone who takes lunar cycles seriously, that will not associate you with the old knowledge and its lingering connotations. The silence was not just institutional, it became personal, self-imposed. That is how the most effective forms of erasure work, not through external prohibition alone, but through the internalization of that prohibition by the people it targets, until they enforce it on themselves. Once you see that mechanism, you begin to see it everywhere. The pattern at its core is this: systems of knowledge that were tied to natural cycles, the lunar calendar, the feminine sacred, the number 13 as a count of the moon's own completions in a year, were systematically reframed as primitive, unlucky, or suspect, often within overlapping historical windows, often without the documentation we would expect if the transition were genuinely organic. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Across Europe, across the colonial world, across the long, slow process of calendar standardization that most of us learned about as pure administrative history, with no winners and losers, no knowledge lost, no alternative frameworks erased. But there were alternatives, there were frameworks, and they are largely gone, not because they failed on their own terms, but because the terms were changed. As if someone had decided systematically and with great patience that the moon's own count should become a source of dread rather than orientation, that Venus's day should carry shadow rather than light, that the fusion of these two, Friday 13, should serve as a cultural shorthand for danger and misfortune, installed so deeply in the collective nervous system that it would perpetuate itself long after anyone remembered its origins, not through one decision, not through one mandate, but through the slow accretion of institutional preference, theological argument, narrative repetition, and the quiet removal of the number from the floors of buildings, as if even the architecture should not have to remember. I began this investigation expecting to find a curiosity, a folklore story with an interesting history, the kind of thing you bring up at a dinner party and everyone nods and moves on. I did not find that. What I found was a template, a case study in how symbols are stripped of meaning, inverted and deployed as instruments of a different kind of orientation, one that trades the moon's own arithmetic for something tidier, something more controllable, something that locates authority not in the sky but in the institutions that have appointed themselves its interpreters. I cannot tell you who made that trade. I cannot tell you precisely when or through what specific chain of decisions the lunar 13 became the unlucky 13, Venus's day became the cursed day, or the specific combination of the two became something people flinch at in the 21st century, in hotels that have no 13th floor, on airplanes that have no 13th row, in a culture that has largely forgotten what it once knew about the moon. But I can leave you with the questions: why does a number that perfectly encodes the moon's own rhythm become the number of bad luck in precisely the tradition that also worked hardest to phase out lunar calendrical systems? Why does the day named for Venus, for love, for abundance, for the sacred feminine become the day of misfortune in precisely the tradition that also worked hardest to suppress the religious and cultural frameworks that had venerated the sacred feminine? Why does the specific combination of the two, Friday, 13, calcify into a singular phobia so durable that it survives into an age of smartphones and space telescopes and genomic sequencing, still powerful enough to make people hesitate, still present enough to shape architecture, still intact enough that most people cannot tell you when or why it began? What exactly are we being told not to remember? And here is the question I cannot stop asking. The one that keeps me returning to these documents, these calendrical fragments, these anomalous gaps in the historical record. If the number 13 was always unlucky, always sinister, always an intruder, why did so many cultures independently across so much of the ancient world use it to count the moon? The moon did not change. The mathematics did not change. The count of lunar cycles in a solar year has not shifted in the time available to human memory. 13 was always the right number. It still is. Someone decided that should feel like bad luck. Someone or some process, some institutional logic, some convergence of interests, whose precise outline I cannot fully trace, but whose effects I can document, accumulate, and point toward, decided that the accurate count of the moon should make you nervous. That decision shaped calendars. It shaped architecture. It shaped the quiet, automatic flinch that moves through a room when someone notes the date, and we have mostly forgotten to ask why.